hoo-has. These scary stories will take you on a strange and fearsome journey, where darkness or fog or mist or the sound of a person screaming or of a dog howling turns ordinary places into nightmarish places where nothing is what you expect. People have been telling scary stories for as long as anyone knows. From the first, there were tales of supernatural creatures that people feared would harm them, boogeymen, monsters, demons, ghosts, and evil spirits lurking in the dark, waiting for a chance to strike. We still tell stories about creatures we fear, but not all of them are about boogeymen and demons. Quite a few are about living people. You'll meet some of them: a fat and jolly butcher, a friendly girl who plays a drum, a neighbor, and others who, at best, were not to be trusted. Scary stories of this kind often have a serious purpose. They may warn young people of dangers that await them when they set out in the world on their own. But for the most part, we tell scary stories to have fun. We turn out the lights or we just leave a candle burning. Then we sit close together and tell the scariest stories we know. Often these include some that have been passed down over hundreds of years. If a story is scary enough, your flesh begins to creep. You get a shivery, shaky, screamy feeling. You imagine hearing and seeing things. You hold your breath as you wait to learn how it all ends. If something startling happens, everyone gasps or jumps or screams. Some people call those shivery, shaky, screamy feelings the heebie-jeebies or the screaming memes. The poet T.S. Eliot calls them the hoo-has. You'd better read the stories in this book while you are still feeling brave and before it gets dark. Then, when the moon is up, tell them to your friends and relatives. You'll probably give them the hoo-has, but they'll have fun, and so will you. It's from Alvin Schwartz, the guy who wrote the books. When she saw him, she screamed and ran. This chapter is filled with ghost stories. In one, a man has just become a ghost, but doesn't know it yet. In another, a pirate ship and crew return from a watery grave, and there are other frightful events. This one's called Something Was Wrong. One morning, John Sullivan found himself walking along a street downtown. He could not explain what he was doing there, or how he got there, or where he'd been earlier. He didn't even know what time it was. He saw a woman walking towards him and stopped her. "I'm afraid I forgot my watch," she said and smiled. "Can you tell me the time?" When she looked at him, she screamed and ran. Then John Sullivan noticed that other people were afraid of him. When they saw him coming, they flattened themselves against a building or ran across the street to stay out of his way. There must be something wrong with me, John Sullivan thought. I'd better go home. He hailed a taxi, but the driver took one look at him and sped away. John Sullivan did not understand what was going on, and it scared him. Maybe somebody's at home can come and get me, he thought. He found a telephone and called his wife, but a voice he did not recognize answered. "Is Miss Sullivan there?" he asked. "No, she's at the funeral," the voice said. "Mr. Sullivan was killed yesterday in an accident downtown." Next one's called The Wreck. Fred and Janine went to the same high school, but they met for the first time at a Christmas dance. Fred had come by himself, and so had Janine. Soon Fred decided that Janine was one of the nicest girls he'd ever met. They danced together most of the evening. At 11 o'clock, Janine said, "I have to leave now. Can you give me a ride?" "Sure," he said. "I've got to go home, too." "I accidentally drove my car into a tree on the way over here," Janine said. "I guess I wasn't paying attention." Fred drove her to the head of Bradley Road. It was in a neighborhood he didn't know very well. "Why don't you drop me off here?" Janine said. "The road up ahead is in really bad condition. I could walk from here." Fred stopped the car and held out some tinsel. "Have some," he said. "I got it at the dance." "Thank you," she said. "I'll put it in my hair," and she did. "Would you like to go out sometime, to a movie or something?" Fred asked. "That would be fun," Janine said. After Fred drove off, he realized he didn't know Janine's last name or her phone number. "I'll go back," he thought. "The road can't be that bad." He drove slowly down Bradley Road through a thick woods, but there wasn't a sign of Janine. As he came around a curve, he saw the wreckage of a car ahead. It had crashed into a tree and caught fire. Smoke was still rising from it. As Fred made his way to the car, he could see someone trapped inside, crushed against the steering column. It was Janine. In her hair was the Christmas tinsel he had given her. One Sunday morning. Ida always went to the 7 o'clock Sunday morning service at her church. Usually she heard the clanging of the church bells while she was eating breakfast, but this morning she heard them while she was still in bed. That means I'm late, she thought. Ida jumped out of bed, quickly dressed, and left without eating or looking at the clock. It was still dark outside, but it usually was dark at this time of year. Ida was the only one on the street. The only sound she heard were the clattering of her shoes on the pavement. Everybody must already be in church, she thought. Ida took a shortcut through the cemetery. Then she quickly slipped into the church and found a seat. The service had already begun. When she caught her breath, Ida looked around. The church was filled with people she'd never seen before. But the woman next to her did look familiar. Ida smiled at her. It's Josephine Kerr, she thought, but she's dead. She died a month ago. Suddenly, Ida felt uneasy. She looked around again. As her eyes began to adjust to the dim light, Ida saw some skeletons in suits and dresses. This is a service for the dead, Ida thought. Everyone here is dead except me. Ida noticed that some of them were staring at her. They looked angry as if she had no business there. Josephine Kerr leaned towards her and whispered, "Leave right after the benediction, if you care for your life." When the service came to the end, the minister gave his blessing. "The Lord bless you and keep you," he said. "The Lord make his face to shine upon you." Ida grabbed her coat and walked quickly towards the door. When she heard footsteps behind her, she glanced back. Several of the dead were coming towards her. Others were getting up to join them. "The Lord lift up his countenance to you," the minister went on. Ida was so frightened she began to run. Out of the door she ran with a pack of shrieking ghosts at her heels. "Get out," one of them screamed. Another shouted, "You don't belong here," and ripped her coat away. As Ida ran through the cemetery, a third grabbed the hat from her head. "Don't come back," it screamed, and shook its arm at her. By the time Ida reached the street, the sun was shining and the dead had disappeared. Did this really happen, Ida asked herself, or have I been dreaming? That afternoon, one of Ida's friends brought over her coat and hat, or what was left of them. They had been found in the cemetery, torn to shreds. Next story is called Sounds. The house was near the beach. It was a big old place where nobody had lived for years. From time to time, somebody would force open a window or a door and spend the night there, but never longer. 3 fishermen caught in the storm took shelter there one night. With some dry wood they found inside, they made a fire in the fireplace. They lay down on the floor and tried to get some sleep, but none of them slept that night. First they heard footsteps upstairs. It sounded like there were several people moving back and forth, back and forth. When one of the fishermen called, "Who's up there?" the footsteps stopped. Then they heard a woman scream. The scream turned into a groan and died away. Blood began to drip from the ceilings into the room where the fishermen huddled. A small red pool formed on the floor and soaked into the wood. A door upstairs crashed shut, and again the woman screamed. "Not me!" she cried. It sounded as if she was running, her high heels tapping wildly down the hall. "I'll get you," a man shouted, and the floor shook as he chased her. Then silence. There wasn't a sound until the man who had shouted began to laugh. Long pearls of horrible laughter filled the house. It went on until the fishermen thought they would go mad. When finally it stopped, the fishermen heard someone coming down the stairs, dragging something heavy that bumped on each step. They heard him drag it through the front hall and out the front door. The door opened and then slammed shut. Again, silence. Suddenly a flash of lightning filled the house with a green blaze of light. A ghastly face staring at the fishermen from the hallway. Then came a crash of thunder. Terrified, they ran out into the storm. A weird blue light. Late one night in October 1864, a Confederate blockade runner slipped by some Union gunboats at the entrance to Galveston Bay in Texas and made it safely to port with its cargo of food and other necessities. Lewis Billings, the master of the small vessel, was getting ready to weigh an anchor when he was startled by a shriek from one of the crew. A strange, old-fashioned schooner with a big black flag was rushing down at us, Billingston said later. She was afire with a sort of weird, pale blue light that lightened up every nook and cranny of her. The crew was pulling at the ropes and doing other work. They paid us no attention, didn't even glance our way. They all had ghastly, bleeding wounds, but their faces and eyes were those of dead men. The man who had shrieked had fallen to his knees, his teeth clattering as he gasped out a prayer, overcoming my own terror that was chilling the very marrows of my bones. I rushed forward, shouting to the others as I ran. Suddenly, the schooner disappeared before my eyes. Some say that it was the ghost of Jean Lafayette's pirate ship Pride that sank off Galveston Island in 1821 or 1822. She was seen again in 1892 in the same waters with the same crew.